The Golden Mask, the most recognized face in all of ancient history. For a century since Howard Carter first peered into that sealed chamber and uttered those two words, the world believed it understood Tutankhamun, the tragic boy king, the forgotten pharaoh, the accidental icon. It did not. The debates about who he really was, where his bloodline came from, and why his family looked the way they did were never resolved by the archaeology. They were shelved. Then DNA arrived. What it found inside the mummies of the 18th dynasty did not confirm the story everyone had agreed on. It dismantled it. The biology of Tutankhamun's family pointed somewhere nobody expected, connected people nobody had linked, and raised questions the artifacts alone could never have answered. The boy king history forgot has turned out to be far stranger and far more significant than the Golden Mask ever suggested. Tutankhamun did not become famous because of what he accomplished. He became famous because of what survived. 9 years on the throne, dead at 19, his name erased from every monument his successors could reach. By any conventional measure of pharaonic achievement, he was a minor figure. What elevated him was the sealed chamber, the undisturbed treasure, and the golden mask. What the mask concealed was considerably more interesting than what it displayed. To understand what the DNA eventually revealed, you have to first understand the family it came from. The 18th dynasty was not a typical royal lineage. It was something closer to a closed genetic system, a bloodline that had been folding back on itself for generations by deliberate design. The Egyptians called it maintaining the divine bloodline. Biology would eventually offer a different description. Tutankhamun's grandfather was Amenhotep III, one of the most powerful pharaohs Egypt ever produced. His grandmother was Queen Tiye, a woman of extraordinary influence whose mummified remains survived intact and whose face prompted debate among Egyptologists for decades. Tiye's parents were Yuya and Thuya, a nobleman and his wife whose tomb was discovered in 1905 and whose preservation was remarkable enough to stop the archaeologists who opened it in something close to shock. Yuya's hair was blonde, almost yellow. His features were sharply defined, his nose prominent and straight. His wife Thuya was similarly well preserved. They did not look like what a century of popular imagery had suggested ancient Egyptians should look like. Nobody could agree on what that meant. The argument went on for decades and produced considerably more heat than understanding. Their grandson Akhenaten inherited the throne from Amenhotep III and proceeded to do something no pharaoh before or after him attempted. He abolished the traditional Egyptian religious system, replaced it with monotheistic worship of the sun disk Aten, built an entirely new capital city in the desert, changed his own name, and dragged the most powerful civilization on earth through a religious revolution that would take generations to undo. He had at least 6 daughters with his great royal wife Nefertiti. He also had at least 1 child with another woman. That child was Tutankhamun. The identity of Tutankhamun's mother was one of the most contended questions in Egyptology for most of the 20th century. The candidates were argued over, dismissed, reasserted, and argued over again. The mummies had been found. The historical records were incomplete. Without biology, the question had no clean answer. What was not in dispute was the physical reality of Tutankhamun himself. When his mummy was examined, it told a story the golden mask had been carefully designed to obscure. He had a clubfoot on his left leg. More than 130 walking canes were found among the objects in his tomb, a number so large it had always been treated as ceremonial until the medical evidence made that explanation difficult to sustain. His bones showed evidence of multiple diseases. His body carried the physical signatures of a constitution that had been compromised before he was old enough to rule anything. The inbreeding pattern within the 18th dynasty was not incidental. It was policy. Pharaohs married their sisters. They married their half-sisters. They married their daughters while, in some cases, the divine bloodline was considered too sacred to dilute with outside ancestry. The ideology was coherent. The biological consequences were not. Each generation that married within the immediate family narrowed the genetic variation available to the next. The physical vulnerabilities accumulated. By the time Tutankhamun was born, the royal lineage had been engineering its own fragility for long enough that the damage was written into his skeleton. He came to the throne at 10. He died at 19. His 2 daughters were both stillborn. The dynasty that had dominated Egypt for a century and a half ended with him, collapsing not from military defeat or political overthrow, but from something quieter and more fundamental. The bloodline simply ran out. What nobody had yet established was where that bloodline had originally come from. The mummies raised the question. The artifacts could not answer it. That required something the 18th dynasty's embalmers had preserved without knowing it. It required the DNA. The mummies did not need DNA to generate controversy. They generated it perfectly well on their own for the better part of a century. The physical evidence had always been difficult to ignore. Yuya's blonde hair, the sharp, prominent features of the royal line, the facial reconstructions of Tutankhamun himself, produced from CT scan data in the early 2000s, which showed a young man whose appearance prompted the same uncomfortable silence that the original mummies had produced in the archaeologists who first unwrapped them. The silence was not scientific, it was political, and it lasted a long time. The debate about the ethnic and geographic origins of the 18th dynasty ruling class was never a quiet academic disagreement. It was loud, it was recurring, and it was almost entirely conducted on the basis of what people could see and what they wanted to see, which are not the same thing. One side pointed to the visual evidence of the mummies and the art. The other pointed to Egypt's geography and insisted the conclusions being drawn were shaped by something other than scholarship. Both sides were partly right, and neither side had access to the one form of evidence that could have settled the argument. The biology was not checked. For decades, it simply was not checked. That changed in stages. The first significant shift came not from the royal mummies directly, but from a broader study of ancient Egyptian remains that reframed the entire question. The 2017 study published in Nature Communications, conducted by researchers at the Max Planck Institute, extracted and analyzed DNA from 90 mummies at a site south of Cairo spanning 1,400 years of Egyptian history. The results were immediate and striking. The ancient Egyptians in the study shared almost no DNA with modern sub-Saharan African populations. The genetic distance was substantial and consistent across the entire dataset. Their closest relatives were ancient farmers from the Levant, the region that includes present-day Israel and Jordan, along with ancient Anatolian populations and Neolithic Europeans. Modern Egyptians, by contrast, carry approximately 8% more sub-Saharan African ancestry than the ancient mummies did. Something changed in the genetic composition of Egypt's population during the medieval period. The ancient population and the modern population are not the same population. This finding did not emerge in isolation. In the same year, a separate study mapped the genomes of individuals recovered from a burial complex in northern Israel dating to the Chalcolithic period, the Copper Age that sits between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. That population carried a specific genetic combination of Levantine, Anatolian, and Iranian ancestry that had not been present in earlier populations from the same region. It also carried something unexpected. Genetic markers for light pigmentation, fair skin, blue eyes, turning up in skeletal remains from a region not typically associated with those traits in the popular imagination. That population dispersed. Its genetic signature moved. It contributed to the ancestry of populations across a wide region during a period of substantial human movement through the ancient Near East. The connection to ancient Egypt, when the mummy data was mapped against what was known about Chalcolithic population movement, was not incidental. It was structural. Applied to the 18th dynasty, the implications were significant. If the general Egyptian population of the New Kingdom period carried Levantine and Anatolian ancestry as the primary genetic substrate, then the royal family that ruled that population almost certainly carried the same ancestral foundation, concentrated and reinforced by generations of marriage within a closed genetic circle. The features that had generated a century of argument were not anomalies. They were the visible expression of an ancestry that the broader DNA data had now placed in the ancient Near East. The mummies had been suggesting this for 100 years. The archaeology had circled it without landing. The broader ancient DNA data established the framework. What remained was to apply the genetics directly to the royal family itself, to extract DNA from the mummies of Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and the women buried alongside them, and to read what the biology actually recorded. When that work was finally done, the answers it produced were not what the debate had prepared anyone to expect. They were more specific, more consequential, and in several important respects, considerably more unsettling. The study that changed everything was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in February 2010. The lead researcher was Zahi Hawass, then Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities. The team spent 2 years extracting and analyzing DNA from 11 royal mummies from the New Kingdom period, cross-referencing the genetic data against CT scan results, radiological analysis, and the historical record. It was the most comprehensive scientific examination of the 18th dynasty royal family ever conducted. The results rewrote what archaeology had spent a century arguing about. The first and most significant finding was the confirmation of Tutankhamun's parentage. The mummy known as KV-55, recovered from a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings in 1907 and argued over ever since, was confirmed as Akhenaten. The genetic data established a direct father-son relationship between KV-55 and Tutankhamun. The argument about whether KV-55 was Akhenaten or Smenkhar or some other male relative of the royal line was settled. It was Akhenaten. Tutankhamun's father had been found, identified, and confirmed by biology rather than inscription. The identity of Tutankhamun's mother was confirmed with equal clarity. She was the mummy known as the Younger Lady, recovered from a cache in tomb KV-35. She was not Nefertiti. She was a daughter of Amenhotep III and Queen Tiye, which made her Akhenaten's full sister. Tutankhamun's parents were brother and sister, not half-siblings, not distant cousins connected by the loose definitions of royal kinship that Egyptologists had sometimes applied to soften the picture. Full siblings. The inbreeding coefficient that calculation produced was among the highest ever documented in a historical royal lineage. The consequences of that finding extended through every other result in the study. The CT scans revealed that Tutankhamun had been carrying multiple overlapping conditions simultaneously. Bone necrosis in his left foot, consistent with Kolar disease, a condition that interrupts blood supply to the bones and causes progressive deterioration. A clubfoot, a cleft palate, a curved spine. Malaria, confirmed by the presence of Plasmodium falciparum DNA in his remains, the most dangerous strain, detected not once but in multiple overlapping infections, suggesting his immune system had been fighting losing battles for years before his death. Any one of these conditions would have been debilitating. Together, they described a young man whose body had been compromised from birth by the genetic consequences of what his dynasty had been doing to itself for generations. The cause of death had been debated since Carter's team first unwrapped the mummy in 1925. The murder theory had generated considerable attention, built primarily around a fragment of bone found loose inside Tutankhamun's skull during examination in 1968. The theory held that he had been struck from behind, assassinated by Ai or Horemheb, or some combination of court conspirators who needed him gone. The DNA study did not support it. The bone fragment was most likely displaced during the embalming process or by Carter's own team during unwrapping. The fracture evidence, examined with modern imaging technology, pointed to a break that had occurred around or after the time of death, not before it. The 2010 analysis concluded that the most probable cause of death was a combination of the leg fracture, possibly sustained in a fall, severe malaria infection, and a constitution so weakened by accumulated disease that the body had no resources left to recover. Nefertiti remained more elusive. The DNA study confirmed her as the mother of the 6 daughters of Akhenaten documented in the historical record. It did not place her among the mummies examined. Whether she was buried under a different identity, whether her tomb remains undiscovered, whether she was the mummy known as the Elder Lady, recovered from the same cache as the Younger Lady, remained open questions the 2010 data could not close. What the data did close was the central question the archaeology had never been able to answer cleanly. Tutankhamun's family had been identified, his parents named, his diseases catalogued, his death explained. The golden mask had always presented a face of serene, ageless perfection. The DNA presented something different. A young man who had been ill his entire life, born into a genetic crisis his dynasty had been building for 100 years, and who died before he was old enough to reverse it. The 18th dynasty did not collapse suddenly. It exhausted itself. The DNA made that visible in a way the historical record had always implied but never quite proved. The inbreeding coefficient calculated for Tutankhamun from the 2010 genetic data was not a marginal figure at the edge of statistical concern. It was severe. His parents were full siblings. That single fact carried consequences that cascaded through every other finding in the study. When 2 closely related individuals produce a child, the probability that the child inherits 2 identical copies of any given gene, including damaged or recessive variants, increases dramatically. The closer the parents, the higher the probability. Brother and sister produced a coefficient that placed Tutankhamun among the most genetically compromised individuals ever documented in a historical royal lineage. His body was the biological ledger of everything his dynasty had invested in bloodline purity. The tomb reflected this in ways that had always been visible but never properly understood. 130 walking canes. The number had been noted, catalogued, and largely explained away as ceremonial. Pharaohs carried crooks and flails as symbols of royal authority. Walking sticks were part of the visual vocabulary of Egyptian kingship. That explanation was always available, and it was always incomplete. The CT scan data and the genetic findings together made it impossible to sustain. Tutankhamun needed those canes. The bone disease in his left foot, the club foot, the deteriorating skeletal structure that the imaging revealed, described a young man for whom walking without support was genuinely difficult. Among 5,000 objects placed in that tomb, 130 of them were designed to help him stand upright. That is not ceremony. That is a medical history written in wood and ivory. The same logic applied to the medications. Honey and various botanical compounds were found among the tomb contents, consistent with treatments for the conditions the DNA and imaging had identified. The tomb was not simply a treasury of royal wealth prepared for the afterlife. It was also, read correctly, a record of a young man's chronic ill health across a short life. The 2 stillborn daughters completed the picture. Enkisenamun was Tutankhamun's half-sister, another product of Akhenaten's closed dynastic circle. Her pregnancies failed twice. The fetal remains, discovered in small nested coffins within the tomb, were examined by CT scan and showed skeletal abnormalities consistent with the genetic pressures that the broader family data had established. The dynasty's obsession with bloodline purity had reached the point where it could no longer produce viable heirs. The next generation did not survive to be born. Tutankhamun died at 19. What followed was a sequence that the DNA findings reframed entirely. Enkisenamun, the last surviving member of Akhenaten's immediate family, found herself without a successor and without options sanctioned by Egyptian royal tradition. Her letter to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I was extraordinary by any measure, a reigning Egyptian queen offering the throne to a foreign prince rather than submit to marriage with an Egyptian commoner. The desperation in that letter was not simply personal, it was dynastic. She knew what the bloodline had become. There were no relatives left who could continue it. Prince Zenanza died en route to Egypt. The circumstances remain unclear. Enkisenamun married Ai, her granduncle, a man who had served 3 pharaohs and understood exactly what seizing this moment required. She disappears from the historical record immediately afterward. I reigned for 4 years. Then Horemheb took the throne and began the systematic erasure that would bury Tutankhamun's name for 3,000 years. The erasure was thorough, names chiseled from monuments, building projects claimed, temples usurped. The ideological logic was straightforward. In Egyptian belief, to erase a name was to extinguish the spirit. Horemheb was not simply rewriting history. He was, by the terms of his own religion, committing a second death. What he could not erase was the biology. The sealed tomb preserved it. The DNA waited. The dynasty that had engineered its own extinction across 5 generations left its most detailed record not in the monuments it built or the names it carved, but in the damaged, disease-ridden bones of a 19-year-old boy buried in a tomb that was never meant for him. The story of Tutankhamun's DNA does not end with Tutankhamun. That is the part that changes the scale of what the findings actually mean. The instinct when confronted with genetic data from a specific historical figure is to treat it as a specific story, file it under Egypt, update the relevant chapter, and move forward with a slightly revised version of what everyone already thought they knew. That instinct is wrong, because the pattern the 18th dynasty data belongs to is not regional, it is global, and it is appearing on every continent where ancient DNA can reach far enough back into the record. Start with Egypt itself. The 2017 Nature Communications study established that the ancient Egyptian population at Abu Sir el-Melek carried ancestry that connected them primarily to ancient Levantine farmers, to Anatolian Neolithic populations, and to the broader genetic heritage of the ancient Near East. Their closest living relatives were not modern Egyptians. Modern Egyptians carry approximately 8% more sub-Saharan African ancestry than the ancient mummies did, a shift that occurred during the medieval period, well after the dynasties the mummies represented. The ancient population and the modern population are genetically distinct. That finding applies to the general Egyptian population. Applied to the 18th dynasty royal family, it carries additional weight. The ruling class of the New Kingdom was drawing from the same ancestral substrate as the broader population, then concentrating and compressing it through generations of internal marriage until the genetic range available to each new generation was a fraction of what it had been at the dynasty's founding. The Chalcolithic population documented at the burial complex in northern Israel adds another layer. That specific genetic combination of Levantine, Anatolian, and Iranian ancestry, the population that carried unexpected markers for light pigmentation in a geographic context that surprised the researchers who found them, dispersed across the ancient Near East during a period of substantial human movement. It contributed to the ancestral foundation that the broader Egyptian mummy data later documented. The features that generated a century of uncomfortable debate about the 18th dynasty were not anomalies introduced by some unexplained external contact. They were the visible expression of an ancient ancestral substrate that the DNA has now traced back through the Chalcolithic and into the deeper layers of Near Eastern population history. But Egypt is not an isolated case. That is the point the broader ancient DNA revolution keeps returning to. In 2016, geneticist Bastian Lamas sequenced mitochondrial genomes from 92 pre-Columbian mummies and skeletons collected across South America and Mexico, remains ranging from 500 to 8,600 years old. His team identified 84 distinct maternal lineages representing the full genetic diversity of the ancient Americas before European contact. Not one of those lineages exists in any living person today. 84 separate lines, all extinct. The diversity that had accumulated over tens of thousands of years was not reduced by European contact. It was erased. Then in 2025 came the first ancient genomes recovered from Colombia. 21 individuals from the Bogotá Altiplano. 7 of the oldest belong to a population documented nowhere else. Their DNA matched no known ancient group in the Americas and no modern population anywhere on Earth. By 2,000 years ago, they had vanished entirely, replaced by a genetically distinct group. A complete population exchange, leaving no descendants. North Africa told the same story at a different scale. 2 women recovered from a rock shelter in southwestern Libya, dead for 7,000 years, preserved by geological accident. Their full genomic analysis, published in 2025, showed no sub-Saharan African ancestry whatsoever. Instead, they belonged to a lineage documented nowhere else, a ghost population isolated in North Africa for 50,000 years, culturally engaged with the world around them and genetically sealed off from it simultaneously. 3 continents, different timescales, different causes, the same result. Populations alive for millennia, coherent and culturally distinct, gone without leaving a genetic trace in the people who came after them. The 18th dynasty belongs to this pattern, a genetically coherent population isolated by ideology rather than geography that compressed itself into extinction across 5 generations. The royal family that built Karnak and Luxor and the temple at Amarna left no direct biological descendants. The bloodline the dynasty spent a century protecting did not survive the century. The DNA confirmed it. The ancient world was full of populations that vanished. Tutankhamun's family was simply one of the few whose disappearance left enough evidence behind to read. Horemheb understood something that most military commanders who seize power do not bother to think about. Killing a person is insufficient. To truly eliminate a rival, you have to kill the name. In Egyptian theology, this was not metaphor. The name was a component of the soul. Destroy it, and the person ceased to exist, not merely in the present, but across all of time, forward and backward simultaneously. Horemheb approached the erasure of Tutankhamun with the thoroughness that belief required. The campaign was systematic. Tutankhamun's name was chiseled from temple walls and replaced with Horemheb's own. The building projects Tutankhamun had commissioned, the Colonnade Hall at Luxor, the Sphinx Avenue at Karnak, were claimed as Horemheb's construction. The restoration stelae that Tutankhamun had erected across the country, the proclamations that had announced the return of the old gods after Akhenaten's religious revolution, were reinscribed with a different pharaoh's cartouche. The work was not completed overnight. It was carried out methodically across a reign of 14 years, the patient administrative dismantling of a person's existence from the historical record. It nearly worked. For 3,000 years, it worked almost completely. Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BC without encountering Tutankhamun's name in any inscription he could read. Julius Caesar arrived 2 centuries later and stood in the same temples from which the name had been erased. Napoleon's expedition of 1798, which brought the first serious European scientific engagement with ancient Egypt, produced detailed documentation of monuments across the country with no meaningful reference to the forgotten pharaoh. The scholars who accompanied Napoleon found Ramesses. They found Thutmose. They found the great pharaohs whose names Horemheb had left intact because they posed no threat to his legitimacy. Tutankhamun was not among them. What saved him was geology. A rainstorm over the Valley of the Kings, sometime within a year of his burial, deposited a meter of rubble across the entrance to his tomb. Workmen building huts for the crews excavating the tomb of Ramesses VI, 2 centuries after Tutankhamun's death, laid their foundations directly above the hidden entrance without knowing it was there. The concealment was accidental, total, and permanent until the morning of November 4th, 1922, when Carter's team uncovered a single step cut into the bedrock. The sealed chamber preserved what Horemheb's campaign could not reach. The objects, the mummies, the biological material that would take another century to read. The erasure had been directed at the name. The body was beyond its reach. The science that recovered the biology is not finished. That needs to be stated clearly before any conclusions are drawn from what it has found. The 2010 JAMA study was rigorous, and its core findings have held. But 11 mummies from one dynasty in one period of Egyptian history is a beginning, not a conclusion. The Old Kingdom, the civilization that built the pyramids at Giza, remains almost entirely unsampled. The pre-dynastic period is genetically dark. Whether the population that constructed the Great Pyramid carried the same ancestral signature as the New Kingdom mummies is currently unknown. The databases against which ancient sequences are compared carry their own gaps. Populations that no longer exist as distinct communities may have carried genetic signatures that would alter the picture if they could be included. Absence of a match in a database is not absence of a match in the world. What is not in dispute is what the data has established. Tutankhamun's parentage is confirmed. The genetic cost of the dynasty's inbreeding policy is documented. The ancestral connections that the mummies hinted at for a century have been placed within a broader framework that the ancient DNA revolution has been building across multiple continents. The boy king was real in a way the golden mask never allowed him to be. Horemheb erased the name from the stone. The tomb preserved the biology. 3,000 years later, the biology turned out to be the more durable record. The erasure failed not because anyone resisted it, but because the sealed chamber held something that chisels cannot reach. The story Horemheb tried to end is the one that turned out not to have a final chapter. The golden mask was always the wrong place to look. The face beneath it, fragile, diseased, genetically isolated, dead at 19, was the product of a dynasty that had been engineering its own extinction for generations before he was born. The DNA did not diminish Tutankhamun. It made him real in a way 3,000 artifacts and a century of Egyptology never quite managed. He was not a symbol. He was the last viable heir of a bloodline that had been narrowing for 100 years, born into a religious revolution he did not choose, handed a throne he could barely stand at, and buried in a tomb that was never meant for him. Horemheb tried to erase him from history. The biology refused. The boy king the ancient world forgot has turned out to carry answers the modern world is only now beginning to know how to ask for.